So like it itself is a honeypot. And of course, the technology of money and the technology of banking doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's other things going around in the world that are relevant to this. One of these things, I'll call them the technology of empires. The nation state or organized power progress of humanity also is alongside the evolution of money and technology. So when humans discover this thing called a monopoly on violence, how does that impact money? Like how does that how do these two particles collide?
Yeah, so in general, the kind of the history of the development of banking for centuries was the history of centralization. And almost any efficiency gain that came from making money more efficient, the trade-off was centralization. So people, as communication improved, as methods of information transfer improved, people kept figuring out more and more centralized ways to solve frictions associated with money. It's like basically eventually they were just like, look, let's let this one authority handle the ledger for the entire country, and it'll be super efficient, right? That's the end state of how things gravitated towards. And then of course you have to trust the people running that. And so that was the general possession. And then there's certain advantages that a nation state gets if they're able to achieve that state in terms of their ability to do warfare. And so, for example, back when people would hold actual coins as money, whenever a country or an empire wanted to go to war, if that war was not very popular, it'd be challenging to fully raise enough taxes to cover that war. And instead, they would try to find various sneaky ways to pay for the war over time in more opaque ways. And so one of the things that they kept turning to is debasement. So they'd say, well, we can't tax more gold because people are going to get mad, but maybe we can make every coin a little bit less gold in it, and they'll barely know, and then we can pay for the gold in that method. But that's and it's effective that they were able to do that. A lot of cultures did that, and it works slowly because you still have to tax. You have to your existing taxes. You have to get the gold coins back. You have to remelt them and then reissue them at these debased levels. And so it's inherently a slow process. Debasement is generally not a very quick process. So you're still confined by how much you can realistically debase. What made the telecommunication era different is that you can debase overnight.
Mm.
And so an example I use in the book is that when World War I broke out, people expected it to be like this regional conflict. This can't possibly be a big war. And the UK and Germany were kind of these rising, Germany was a rising power against the existing power of the UK. And it was kind of like United States and China today. Whereas back then, there's so many trade relationships between these countries, even though they were kind of rivals. And people were like, they can't possibly go to war. What would it mean for the economy? But because there's all these pre-existing military relationships, multiple countries got involved. And then the UK, which did not have any sort of pre-existing military alliance, like it didn't have to get involved, but they did not want Germany to win and get too big across Europe. So they decided that they're going to go fight this war in continental Europe, even though it doesn't directly involve them. And so what they tried to do was, they're not going to raise taxes for you. They can only raise taxes so much. People are going to hate that. And so instead, they said, okay, we're going to issue these war bonds. And we're going to go win the war in Europe. And the problem was, and even though their reserve currency status at the time, this is the most powerful country, they were only able to raise like a third of their intended war bond target. And so that was not enough to go fight the war, and it would kill perceptions. Like the momentum would be dead if they said, our war bond auction failed. I guess the public doesn't like this after all. And so instead, they just lied. They just printed the money. They just went to the central bank and did this like trick where the central bank like loaned a crazy amount of money to like senior officials at the central bank to go buy the rest of the war bonds. So they just printed the money, and what they did then was debase all of British household savings and ongoing wages, and they channeled that towards war in Europe. So even though taxes would not have been popular, the war bonds were not popular, they just did it anyway by rapidly debasing. And compared to debasing coinage, you can debase abstracted banknotes or bank deposits overnight. And so they can just cut the currency in half very quickly and take that savings from people and put it in a war. And then in that case, because the UK was the global reserve currency, they also debased tons of other countries' reserve holdings and just channeled it into war. And so it was taxes are enforced, but they're transparent, whereas debasement is both enforced and opaque. Mm. And so value can be done in things that the public doesn't necessarily agree with.
It strikes me, Lyn, too, that another nice property of that form of debasement is with taxes, you can only tax your own citizens. But if with debasement, you can tax other people's citizens if they are
if you have the
holding
global
your
unit
bonds.
account.
If they're if you have the reserve currency and they're holding your bonds. So this is the the Brits being able to tax everybody.
Yeah, it's the ultimate rug pull. And the UK, and part of why the UK was effective in the war is because they had the biggest opportunity to rug pull. Germany, there's generally, like Germany had foreigners holding its currency as well, so they had rug pull potential. It came down like who had the biggest rug pull potential. And the UK had more rug pull potential because they were the biggest global empire at the time. And so yeah, basically that what debasement introduces, and especially fast centralized debasement, is that ability to channel value. Basically, instead of just running out of your own gold, a nation can run out of its entire citizens' liquid savings before it gets exhausted in its war effort. And so countries that don't do that are likely to lose. Ones that can do that are likely to win. And so if one country does it, it kind of forces every country to do it.
It's like an all-in total war type scenario. And I guess the problem with that level of rug pull, though, is you only get to do it once.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, Ron Paul has that, I think, a famous quote where he said that it's not an accident that the history of central banking, like the century of central banking coincided with the century of total war. I mean, part of it is just the technology itself got us to the point where total war was possible, but also this kind of opaque rug pulling did contribute to making wars probably bigger than they otherwise would have been. You can only do that rug pull once, but then it comes down to what's the alternative, right? And so it's not like the UK hyperinflated after they did the rug pull. They just lost a lot of value. And to this day, there's still foreigners that hold British currency. They sharply diminished their status on the global stage. They kind of, they shot their main weapon, and they didn't really have a lot left to go. The United States, I mean, when they rug pulled people at the end of Bretton Woods, they were able to kind of recoup that, because even after they rug pulled everyone, they were still the world's largest economic and military power. And so when the world's, kind of scrambling to figure out what we're going to use as our ledger, they still fell back to the dollar again. And so sometimes you get a second or a third rug pull if there's no second best, basically. Right. If the next best thing is still you after you've rug pulled, people fall back again. That's kind of the tragedy of global finance.
Yeah, maybe less of a rug pull, but just like how much oil is left in the tank. Like how much energy did you just consume, and do you still have some energy left? Lyn, we started this conversation talking about like the emergent phenomenon of money, talking about like trust and relationships. Then this like commodity money comes in where we don't have to trust. We just trust the supply of the commodity money. So we deposit trust into the commodity money. These commodity monies kind of have a Darwinian fight with each other, and then we end up as gold. And then the banks come and reintroduce a new form of centralization and trust. And these things kind of just like coagulate to where we are now, which is everything, like you said, like gold centralized, banks centralized, and then armies centralized by empires. And this is, to me, a story of the capturing of this emergent phenomenon of money into empires, into who has a monopoly on violence. So where we started, which is this just bottom up need for humans to more fluidly trade with each other, that need then got inverted and created this like inherent centralization force of whoever controls the ledgers likely also has the largest army. And so to me, this is a story arc of this natural phenomenon ending up like captured, this super powerful force ending up being captured by a monopoly on violence. Is this how you see the same arc?
Generally, yeah. I mean, I think we have to be a little bit careful about overstating it, because, I mean, there were empires, Roman Empire, for example, before modern money. Generally, those empires would be built on, better technology, finding a way. The combination of like organization and technology allows them to have a very wide degree of conquering. And so empires were already around. But I would say, in the modern era, nation states, affect and define our lives on average worldwide more than they did back then. So we've consolidated from this kind of feudal environment to this more nation state environment, in large part because money evolved in such a way that it pretty much couldn't help but be captured by the local government, because there's been a need for abstracting and centralizing it. And so, at least until the invention of Bitcoin and the invention of fast settlements, we've been in this kind of local maximum where everybody's kind of reliant on these centralized ledgers. And then even those centralized ledgers are relying on a global ledger. And so during the classical gold era, they would try to use gold itself as the base layer, and they would have their own central bank ledgers, and they would use gold for international settlement, or really just often just gold claims. When that broke, they turned to the Bretton Woods system, which is even more centralized because they